Paula and Becker, and went to college at Southeastern Mass University in the 1980s to study textiles. Actually started in illustration and changed my major to textiles because I had friends that were weaving in the department, and I would visit with them and just was like just so excited and interested in all the threads and the equipment. So after a year and a half, I switched my major to textile design and studied there for 4 years for my undergrad, and then moved to New Jersey for my first job at a company, Chromatex, that eventually closed. They were in Pennsylvania and in New Jersey. I stayed there for about a year and a half and started interviewing for other jobs, and ended up in Pennsylvania and Philadelphia working with Craftex mills. And that was really like the start of like the creativity for me. Chromatex was very like low end and not really interesting fabric for me. The constructions was mostly Dobby fabrics, but when I went to Craftex, I loved Philadelphia. The mill was right in the center of the city in the Kensington area, and in a neighborhood with the elevated subway, like going by, you'd hear it, passing by the window, and just a lot of activity going on. And I had never lived in a city before, so that was like really fun for me. And at Craftex Mills, there was a lot of history. It was family owned, a lot of characters, just like really at every job in the industry. There's always a few characters that you're kind of like, oh. But the thing that I recall the most from working there was the constructions were really beautiful. Tapestry constructions, a lot of jacquard, which I learned there because I had never studied jacquard in college. So I really learned on the job, and I was trained by a few people, especially Christine McBrien, who was the design director, and we're still friends to this day. But I have some photographs that hopefully I can share with you at some point. When I arrived there, they were in the process of building or moving to another facility. The mill, they had a mill up in upstate Pennsylvania, and the original mill was in the basement of this building. And it was so cool. It was like it just stopped one day, and it was just sitting there for decades. Gradually, one after another, the looms stopped, and they still had, I think, 2 or 3 looms that were still weaving samples, but for the most part, they were all just like quiet. And we would often go into the basement and have lunch with some of the mill people, and just mostly design and mill people. And I got to know Stanley and Mike, and the photographs that I hope I can share in this exhibit, you'll meet Stanley and Mike. And they wore, their sort of like work clothes all the time, the like denim jumpers, and I don't know what they call those, and would just tell us stories about the mill.
What did they
do? They were originally weavers and fixers of looms, and there were only a couple of pieces of equipment that was still running, but they did other things, cleaned, just were there, and interesting people. So anyhow, I stayed there for, I think it was maybe 4 or 5 years, and I decided that I wanted to go on to grad school. So I applied to grad school in Michigan and studied there for 2 years at Cranbrook, and then came back into the industry after I graduated, and also did a little bit of teaching at different schools. But I felt like for me, Craftex was really a special place. But my position after I graduated from grad school was Stevens Linen in Massachusetts, and they were acquired by Guilford of Maine at the time. And it was the Stevens Linen collection for Guilford of Maine. They hired me as the design director and had a small group of designers, really amazing, again, a wonderful mill in Webster, Mass. And I have a few samples that in the show that you'll see from there, but a lot of textured yarns. They made a lot of their own yarns, and textured warps, and just like really, pretty colors. So I was there for a few years as a director of design, and then I moved on to Fall River to work with Quaker Fabrics, where I met Kristin Crane, and we worked together there for quite some time. And I was the design director for the decorative jobber division, and worked very closely with sales and design as a small design team. And we created like high-end decorative fabrics for upholstery. A lot of fun. Yeah, it was we created some of our own warps and some of our own yarns, and came up with a concept a little bit later on for a sample box that was a beautiful linen box that Kristin actually will have in the show with some of her work. And it was embossed with a W for the Whitaker, and we would take that with us, like this little kind of special collection that we didn't sample like largely at all. It was just small samples, and sometimes we would even have like blankets, like blanket strips that we would sort of roll out and share with the jobbers. And it was kind of like, I don't know, that they were involved in the process of designing with us and choosing colors and making kind of tweaks to patterns along the way. So I don't know, maybe I should let Kristin tell you how she got started, and then we can talk about Quaker.
Yeah, so I went to Philly Textile in the 90s, and I don't even know how I chose textile design. It was like I sewed a lot, I was knitting, I was applying to colleges for like nutrition and weird things, and not excited about it. My mom one day was like, "You don't seem excited about getting into any of these colleges. Let's look at Philly Textile." She had toured it with my sister, and since I was sewing a lot, so I went there and I had the tour, and I thought like, oh, okay, like this feels like more of my people, like there's sewing machines. And I think I thought I would do knit design, but when I got there, like the weaving it's funny because I remember the first semester having to do like drawing, and I thought, oh my God, I'm not an artist, but the textile classes I was liking, like kind of, but the more at Philly Textile, we sort of started with more technical classes in the beginning. And then when I had my first like weave design studio, just being at the loom, I thought like, ooh, this feels right. I liked the machine, I liked the math, I liked the creative part, the color. And I really felt like up until that point, I always felt like, oh, I was crafty, but I'm not creative. Like I can sew, but I'm not like a creative person. Like I think I thought like artists drew well and everybody else was just crafty, I guess. But I feel like weaving was sort of this nice combination of things I felt good at. And I felt like I really found my creative spot at the loom. So the summer between my junior and senior year, I had an internship at Burlington Industries in New York, in their converter division. So I lived at home, and I would take the bus in that whole summer, and it was great. I had a blast. And I just knew I wanted to live in New York. I mean, at that point in my life, that was like the only goal, was to like live in New York, like live in Hoboken and commute into New York. And like, that was the plan. So I had a job by like the beginning of the spring semester of my senior year. The people I'd interned with hired me. So I worked there. And about 6 months into my time in New York, the mill decided to relocate down to North Carolina. So I was sort of like invited to move down, and I just thought, this isn't like, I don't think the South is for me. And I still just thought New York was the only place I wanted to be. But so I just stayed till the end it's weird now thinking about it in this kind of timeline, because I remember then it was like all the people were peeling off who didn't want to go to, and I kind of wanted to travel. So I didn't want to get a new job right away. I kind of felt like there's going to be so many. So whatever, I wanted to travel because I was still living at home, and I thought like this would be my opportunity. So it was like seeing people peel off and get new jobs, and then they were bringing up designers from the South to like live in New York and train. So I was like kind of training people. So I was there till like the last week before they all moved, and then I went to Europe for like 6 weeks. And when I came back, I thought, I don't want to be in New York anymore. Like that wasn't the goal anymore. So I just kind of was researching jobs, and through my college, I got the job at Main Street Textiles, and I went up for that interview, and Dawn Stopka interviewed me, and we interviewed in the morning, My mom and I had driven up together. My mom and I went for lunch. We came back. She offered me the job. And I was like, okay, where would I live? Like, and she said, well, a lot of people your age live in Providence. So we drove home through the east side of Providence. And I thought, okay, I'll live here. Like, I just was ready to have a change. So that was so then I moved up here and worked for Dawn for a couple of years at Deborah. And then that was starting to not be a great place anymore. So I interviewed at Quaker with Addie first, and they were having a hiring freeze. And then like a few months later, she called me and she put me in touch with, and then you were hiring when it.
Okay.
Yeah, I remember Addie saying, I didn't want to tell you we had a hiring freeze because I still wanted to meet you. So I showed her and then I remember when I had my interview with you, I had my like industry stuff, and then at the end I had like hand woven samples. And I remember you telling me, I love that you still have hand weaving samples in your portfolio. So I just felt like
I remember that too.
Had a good. I remember leaving that interview thinking like, oh, I really want to work for Paula. Like I felt we had a nice connection. Yeah.
So why did you leave Main Street?
So that was 2002. Yeah, that spring.
And you left because
I was ready for something new, and I also felt like there was no place to move up there. Like I kind of was where I was. I didn't click a lot with Dawn was amazing. She was such a great boss, but the rest of upper management I didn't quite click with. And I felt like the jobber division there was a little of an afterthought. Like I liked designing that stuff. But I always felt like we were just like, I don't know, like a P, like, oh, okay, Dawn can have the jobber group. Like, I didn't feel like we were respected as much as sort of the rest of the designers. So I feel like Quaker felt like a really like design forward place, and it had a reputation for being that. And I remember when I got there feeling like, oh, they really respect design here. And it's really, because I was at Main Street. Now that I think about it, they had just moved to that new mill, and I was there very briefly before I left. And I remember by that time I was like, oh my God, I'm ready for something different. Yeah. And then I was at Quaker till the last day there.
So talk about that. So talk about like, what was it? How did you feel things changing? I mean, well, of course, talk about like what was happening in the industry and how you,
Well, in the beginning, it was so great. We were traveling, we would take turns going to European shows, San Francisco, New York. I mean, it was B. Spires was the VP of design, and she really respected everyone and respected, knew that we needed to have inspiration. We couldn't just go to High Point and look at magazines. So everyone, I mean, all the designers, we took turns traveling, sometimes together, sometimes in separate groups.
And I think she did make it a point that to keep design, because I feel like at a lot of other places, design always felt like a little bit like sales was more respected, and they could just sort of bark at us what they wanted, but at Quaker, design was on the same plane as she made it clear to the salespeople also, you don't have anything. You can't. There's nothing to sell if we don't have good stuff. So
it needs to be like a team effort. And actually, going back to when I was interviewing for the position at Quaker, I wanted to meet some of the salespeople that I'd be working with because I'd had some not so good experiences before, and I just felt like it was important that I felt like a connection, like we could work together. And fortunately, it worked out really well. And they had a huge sales force and, a big department in design too. And I felt like for the most part, the communication, especially in our division,
we had a great.
We had Gilly and, and then some of the West Coast people as well. But so that was critical for me because I didn't design as much as Kristin because I was merchandising and traveling, but Kristin, you were like, oh my God, especially after having a young child, it was like, and you wanted to travel, and she was like what I just always there to take the collection and be super enthusiastic about it and work with the salespeople and the clients.
So where do you travel to? Where did you go?
I feel like I went to New York a lot,
Yeah.
since that's where most of the jobbers were. I feel like I did have some inspiration trips. I wasn't there quite for the heyday of all the like super fabulous ones, but I did get to go to San Francisco once, which was fun for kind of an inspiration trip. But I feel like I went a little bit more to New York.
So what changed? Like, why did you stop having the design trips? I mean, inspirational trips.
Yeah, I feel like that was like when you talk about like how we started to feel the beginning. I feel like stuff like that started to peel off a little first. That
because you came in
wasn't-
2002, you said,
Yeah.
right? So yeah, it was. I mean, it was gradual. We had layoffs, and our department at one point there were 5 of us,
Yeah.
and one by one,
Yeah.
and it ended up just being the 2 of us in the end.
Yeah. I feel like there'd be ups and downs, but then there hit a point where it's like, oh, it feels like it's only like the
Mhm.
layoffs would, they and actually having a good relationship with our salespeople kind of kept us a little bit more informed, because I feel like there were some other designers who were a little bit more like surprised every time these things would happen. But I feel like since we had such a good relationship with our salespeople, they were always kind of, letting us know like things aren't as good, or like we had a little bit more of a sense that, but yeah, I mean, near the end you could tell that it was.
But I never expected us to just close like so abruptly.
Yeah, how did that happen?
It was during the 4th of July week, which the 4th of July week was we didn't shut down, like a lot of mills did. You could work that week or not.
But most of the people in the mill were not there. So it was shut down for
Were
them.
you on vacation that week?
No,
You
I
were
was there.
Yeah, I was traveling in North Carolina just prior to that week, with the Whitaker Naturals collection, with meeting some of the high-end furniture manufacturers, and we had great meetings. But I remember checking back in Fall River and talking with a couple of people, and they were like, something's going on here. It's kind of like a weird vibe. I came back, there were maybe half of the design staff was working that week.
Yeah.
And it was, do you remember the
I
exact
remember they were
date?
like, I think it was the 7th.
Of July in 2007, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, that whole week we were like, something's going on. Because I forget how old I was, but I was only 10 years into my career. So I was bringing home everything I would want for my portfolio, which I did periodically all the time, but I remember thinking like, okay, like I'm going to make sure. Yeah. But yeah, that week it was like, something's really, and that day I remember like we showed up and there was security at the door. And it was like, okay,
never
like that's the day I was like, I better save my contact. Yeah. And I remember I had an outstanding expense check from a trip.
Yeah.
And I remember like Ernie brought it to, or whoever would bring them around, but it was like handwritten. And I was like, I'm going to go deposit this. And I went out at lunch. And and all day they were like, we're going to have a meeting at 10 a.m. at 10:30 right after lunch, and
and then it was delayed.
Yeah,
to like
until like 5:30.
So
a lot of people had left.
Yeah,
I was in the car on the way home by then because we're like, well, I guess it's going to be tomorrow. Like,
I was there. I mean, I came in the security guard. It's like, can I see your ID? And it's like, we've never had to do that before. So I got in and I called my husband and said, this is weird. And he's like, find some boxes and maybe start packing up if you're stuck.
When I left that day, I thought, I'm taking, in case I can't get back in, like I'm just going to make sure I have whatever I would want.
Yeah. So the meeting was hard. If I remember correctly, and I think it was B. I don't think that anyone from upstairs was there, our vice president, and she had to give us the news, and there were only like a handful of designers there. On our floor, it was, and I wish my memory was better. I kind of like blanked it out, but it was just, it was hard because she said that we were closing and it was like immediate, but that they would be in touch and we could come back to pick up our things. We didn't have to take it.
And they were like, oh, and your health insurance ended on June 30th. Remember that? Yeah.
And I think we get 2 weeks pay? I don't, maybe I did because I was management. I think I got 2 weeks pay. But yeah, it was kind of a shock. And I remember coming back a few days later and just
we were allowed to go back and clean our office.
Clean up what we needed. And actually that day when I left after they closed and I was walking out to my car, my husband and daughter were waiting for me. And I guess a reporter had stopped them and asked them some questions, but I felt, very supported by them, but especially by our group. And I want to talk a little bit about after, like the weeks and months after.
Yeah.
Did you find that
Remember
really
stressful?
stressful?
Yeah, and then we had that big meeting at the high school, and the whole thing had to be in English and Portuguese because of the community of the mill, that they legally couldn't have 2 meetings, one only. So I remember we had to sit through this meeting where it's we heard the whole thing, and all these people were like, what do you mean our health insurance? Some of these people from the mill who were like, my wife's in the hospital right now, or it was so.
Yeah, it was at
bizarre.
Durfee High School, and
They had the mill workers and the designers.
They were all the high school auditorium. Yeah.
So talk about how seeing all these people who were losing their
They were
jobs.
families.
Yeah, it was really sad because, for me, I felt like I saw it coming a little bit, or at least knew I got to get out of here. If the mill doesn't close, it wasn't feeling like much of a future for me. So there was all this stuff, because I had other friends at other mills who were having similar things. So I knew there was this trade act that I could maybe go back to school and get a degree, which I ended up doing at the community college in Fall River and got a certificate in graphic design. But so for me, I sort of had a little bit of a plan that I put into action because I was like, okay, so in September I want to start. If I'm going to do the school thing, I got to do it in September because otherwise I'll have no money. But I remember being at that meeting and just seeing husband and wives who both worked there and some of their kids and people who were closer to retirement, because my little perception of it was a little, just looking at it I got to work for so many more years. I have to, and I felt in a position that I could be a little bit more nimble than some of these people who, it was so sad.
I felt I was fortunate because I worked with a lot of the clients, and I reached out to a couple of mills. I did freelance work for Valdez, and I also worked part-time with Quaker Fabrics, and but I felt like this obligation to help other people find jobs. I remember I knew you were going to go back to school, but there were
a few
other
interviews too with Wear Best, and I remember this interview for someone in New Jersey, and I was showing my portfolio, and they were like, "Oh, that one!" They were already knocking off Quaker.
So maybe I think this whole idea of what you were going to do afterwards is, and for you, you had the opportunity to, you were young and you had a career, but then these families, there's a whole other thing, so.
And some of them, I think, were so blindsided by it too. I feel I felt a little bit more. I remember even our salesperson, "Hey, you should keep looking," But there were so many people who had no idea. They were just completely blindsided. The ones in the mill, I think they kept being told it'll be okay, or.
So how did you see the environment outside of that when you guys were let off? You had been watching mills close, right? It wasn't a surprise, right?
Yeah. I know. We didn't have a lot of options unless we wanted to relocate. Which most people didn't want to do that.
And for me, it was okay, I'd been at Burlington and they were relocating down south. So now I'm here, and I thought my skills are really specific. What if I get this job and 5 years from now, they're what would I do? So I felt like I sort of had to go back and get some more retraining. And I remember people would be like, "Well, what did you always want to do?" And I'm like, "Well, this actually." It wasn't that easy to just if I'd wanted to be in graphic design, I would have done that then. It was a real kid.
Yeah, I was fortunate that I had I did have some freelance work, but I had a phone call from Marge Perrier, who taught at UMass Dartmouth, and I had stayed in touch as an alumni, and she heard what happened, and she knew that I had my MFA and I had taught there before adjunct, so she brought me in, and I think it was like almost 3 years part-time faculty teaching design, the woven design, with the undergrad students there. So I loved that. I wish that there was an opportunity for a full-time teaching job, because that was, I think, where I would have liked to have gone. But since Quaker closed, I've been juggling, teaching, freelance, and my artwork. So I felt really fortunate that I had those three things, but it financially it was a big step down for me, because I was in more of a management position. But I have to say, it's more fulfilling. It's more like meaningful, the work that I do now, and that I had been doing after some stress, because I was still designing majority of my time. But the teaching part, especially, where I'm kind of back in that role again, I like that a lot. And it allows me to take the experience over the years as a designer and an artist, and sort of give it back in a way.
It's actually what made Paula such a good boss, was like her spirit of teaching. Like I always felt like you as my boss were, like, you wanted me to improve, you wanted me to do better, you wanted me to succeed, and I always joke that like you and Don like ruined me. Like the first time in my life I had a bad boss, I was like, I don't understand what's happening. David's like, you just have a really bad boss. I said, I haven't had one of those. Like, they're supposed to care about me and my well-being. But I think because you're teachers, like, you have that spirit of a teacher.
The nurturing side, I don't know what it is.
But you want us to learn more. Like you want to share all your knowledge, which is always.
Yeah, I think that our philosophy, sort of our way of thinking as a department within Quaker, we were the smallest little department, and we didn't have, I don't think we were watched as closely, so we had more freedom to be creative, but we didn't have this top down kind of pyramid. It was a collaboration. That's how I always looked at it.
But you cultivated that too. Like that it wasn't competitive. Like we were all, and I think that's what a good leader does.
Yeah. We had a great group, and we just and I mean that's why we're still friends.
It's funny to think that so many of those contacts I'm still friends with. All these years later.
So I want to ask one more question. That we heard about what you're doing now, but what just after you went back to graphic design, just tell your story.
Yeah, so I did that for a year, the training program, and then I got a job. I was only there for about 9 months in this small graphic design studio, and then it was 2009, so that's kind of when the economy tanked. So suddenly that job stopped, and then I kind of had a weird little I was working, so I was making stuff too, and Etsy was new, so I was kind of selling things on Etsy, and then I got this job working for Craftland in downtown Providence, selling handmade things, and that was actually, the best part of that was just being connected with all these artists and just downtown and sort of this broader community. I felt really connected to Providence through that job, because I feel like until then I was commuting to Fall River. So working at Craftland kind of got me a lot more connected to that. And then I started doing more marketing things and social media for the landlord of Craftland, who does this downtown merchant group. And then, so now I do a little bit more marketing for a small business that it circles slightly back around. It's kind of an online business of a pattern design library that sells into kind of commercial materials for more commercial than residential, but I don't do any of the designing for that. I just do more of the marketing, and which is, there are days where I'm like, how did I get here? It's especially, the social media is kind of a weird side of it. But yeah, it's funny to be on the more marketing side because I definitely struggle with like, I liked being a little bit more on the making side. I mean, there's still a lot of creativity that's the part of my current jobs that I like more, like a little bit more writing and stuff like that. But yeah, I definitely miss. So I do more of the textiles in my kind of personal work, but in a weird way, like I do so much more of it now than I did when I was working in textiles. And so I feel like I have a different relationship to textiles now that is actually kind of richer.
I think I have a question that when you look back at it, do you still hold anger or frustration or regret, or do you miss being in the industry, or have you moved past that to like embrace?
I think I've moved
I
past.
struggle with it. I definitely have moved past. I mean, like when we talk about it and sometimes things come up, it's like, I do sort of get these flashes. And it's definitely been weird for me because I think these experiences have kind of early in my career taught me like sort of never trust anything. Like I just feel like anything can be like pulled out from under you at any second. So I'm always a little bit, I don't know. But I feel it's just a strange, like so I mean, I don't know how things would have gone if I'd stayed on that path, but I also feel like I was sort of ready for something new. Like, I mean, sometimes I look back on it with like rose-colored glasses, you know, like our little group was so great, but
that's what I focus
kind
on
of the
too.
bigger picture, you know, we would get frustrated with things. I don't know. Like, I definitely, things can bubble up where I can still feel a little resentful, I guess.
You probably wouldn't create this beautiful
Right,
work if you
yeah.
were still like working full time as a designer. I mean, she created beautiful designs, but the opportunity to have time to develop your own work, you know, would be harder.
Because I do remember too, like just being like, oh my God, we're creating so much waste. I mean, remember when we used to look through color work and just thinking, we're just throwing out all this stuff, you know, it was just like all to the landfill. But
I remember I wanted to design a textured warp like at Stevens Linen, and I was ready to hand weave it on my hand loom, and B was like, "No, we're going to make a full beam. We'll put it in, and we'll weave it in production." And I was like, "Well, what if it doesn't work?" You know, and it turned out that it was too dense, and it was not weaving well. It wasn't making a great shed, and so they slashed the beam, got rid of the yarn, and you know, I just was like, "Oh, yeah." So that was we did have a lot of waste, and I think everyone did, you know, all the mills would it was just, and also the chemicals, like with the back coating. I mean, our fabrics were not coated so much because they were higher end, but some of them more like Quaker side of it. I don't know, I think for me I held like some anxiety like from the whole experience that was not healthy. And I had to, because I was a middle manager, when I freelanced, I had to like learn like how to design on a computer, but I couldn't afford EAT or Sophos or any of those programs. So I learned Adobe Photoshop mainly, and that was a challenge for me because I hadn't been designing as much. But I was like really happy that I did it because it gave me new skills. And then when I was working at Regal Fabrics, they're converter, so they design prints, wovens, embroidery, and even some velvets, all in China, which I was kind of like a bit ambivalent about that, but I needed to work. But the skills that I had brought with me through illustration years ago, before I switched over to textiles and learning the computer skills, I already had the kind of the weave stuff down. It like broadened my my horizon of like designing like all types of textiles. So that was really fun, and that was like the silver lining, I think, for me. I actually hated traveling to north of Boston to work from Rhode Island. That was really difficult, but I was working with Don Stopka and we would drive together. Yeah. So, but anyhow, after I left that position, I didn't design as much. I haven't been designing as much, and I have to say I prefer to make things by hand than like digitally on the computer, editing and all that at this stage in my career. But for you, I mean, would you consider like going back into the industry? Would you interview for?
I don't know. I don't think so.
No.